Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It is Wednesday, August 25th, 2021, and on this episode, I'm going to explore a really important question. That is, when did things go off the rails of the limits of the Constitution? When did the Constitution really stop being enforced? Because we live under the largest government in the history of the world. To say that it's enforced in any meaningful way is absolutely absurd today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with what I see as 4 of the most common answers people have to this question. Then I've got some insight on power, precedent, and the Constitution itself from people like Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And then I've got my answer on this, which I guess could change over time, but I think I'm the only thing I might do is go back a little earlier if you want a little hint there. But it might surprise you the way I look at this. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives of the show for over 3 years on individual episodes. I usually publish them about an hour after the live broadcast is done. You'll find links to stuff that I'm talking about. So I've got a bunch of articles and original source documents for today's episode that I will link to that. You can find all the different platforms we're on. We have live streaming, mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch. But in case you notice that we're missing someday and you want to start using other platforms, I encourage you more than anything to start using some of the non-mainstream platforms. We're on places like Odyssey.com and Rumble and Gab TV and Minds, Brighteon, BitChute, and elsewhere. And we're also on the podcast edition for those of you who want audio only. Places like Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and the rest. And of course, you can also find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. I can't thank you enough for any consideration you can give to supporting our work. All that and more at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And just a quick look over in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream. Hello to Richard Fowler and Bob Landry in San Antonio. Ragnar. Matt Lawley says 1971. I mean, that's a good one. Richard Kramer, Dixie Strong, Cheriton, Patricia Ravioli, MRGF, Tim Martin, DHD Van Horn. Who else do I see here? It's good to see you, Richard Kramer. Alan Hughes, Harry Elzo, Dan Reed, my buddy up in Oregon, Joe Vasquez. I'm sorry if I just doxed you, Dan. Oregon's a big place. Dan does a great podcast, by the way, called The Culinary Libertarian. I hope you guys check it out. He's had me on there as well, Mike Meharry. So good to see you, Dan, and everybody else. Let's get right to this. And I want to first start out, like I said, Patricia says 1865, and I'm going to get right to that, actually. Let's start with the 4 that I usually hear the most. And it's not necessarily a specific year. I'm going to highlight it by presidents. So you've got kind of a span of when people talk about this. And the first one is what Patricia Dance just said in the live chat, 1865 or 1861 to 65. You got this guy, Abraham Lincoln, of course. We have the war. We've got things like suspension of habeas corpus, greenbacks, and the like. So that's a real big one. People will think that the structure of the system, and then at the outset of that, the 14th Amendment and corporation doctrine changed the entire nature of the system to a much more centralized one from 1861, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's time in office. Number 2, and I guess I'm going kind of in order of years, not necessarily in how often I hear these. Number 2 is this guy, Woodrow Wilson. He was in office, I think, 1913 to 21. We all hear that phrase, 1913 was a really bad year. Of course, we had the 17th Amendment, the Federal Reserve. We had race riots and segregation. This guy was a racist pig, like some of the worst out there. World War I, of course, especially after hearing that the U.S. was not going to be entering into that type of thing. And that led to, of course, World War II. And then we have this guy, FDR, is the third one that I hear very, very often. His New Deal era. I think he was in office 33 to 45. We've got New Deal, internment concentration camps. And it wasn't just Japanese. They stole the gold with Executive Order 6102. We had the court packing threat in order to push the court into a more political weapon that it is today rather than what it was supposed to be, independent. And then the last one I hear is really just anything in current time. 71 was a good one. I should have had that on the list too. I forget who mentioned that, but that was a pretty good one too. But I think when we're talking about gold and sound money, we can also look back to setting the foundation with FDR, with that executive order where they stole the gold. And then 71 was the last vestiges of any type of kind of fake pseudo gold standard. And then current times, I think, is the last one. And it's not any particular year, but every few years, we hear one side or the other of the political spectrum saying things like, oh, in 2009, we heard one side say, well, now things are starting to get bad. Things are going off the rails. And then in 2017, they stop saying it. And then the other side says, oh, well, now things are going off the rails. Things are getting really bad. And then they stop saying it this year in 2021. And then it's back to the other side. Oh, now things are getting off the rails. And we hear this back and forth and back and forth. And they're basing it on partisan nonsense. Now, with those four in mind, I want to consider some views I think that are important for my understanding or my take on this, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. We've had a couple of thoughts from Patricia, 1865, and then, of course, the guy who said 1971. And I'll get to my call on this in a little bit. But with those four in mind, let's consider some views of leading founders, as I mentioned right off the outset. I want to start with Benjamin Franklin. He is the guy, and he actually wrote the speech out. He was pretty old at this time. And James Wilson read it on the floor of the Philadelphia Convention. This is a speech that he gave making the motion to actually put signatures to the Constitution, meaning in Philadelphia, they were going to send it to the states for ratification. They were done in the Philadelphia Convention, and everyone there, they wanted everyone there, even if you had objections, just put your name on it, and then we'll debate it and go from there. And Benjamin Franklin made the motion September 11th, 1787. We call that Constitution Day. And he said this. First, he started out by saying that there were several parts of the Constitution that he did not approve of. That was literally the first sentence. There are a number of parts in this that I don't approve of, but I can't guarantee that I'll always think that way because I'm old enough now to recognize that I change my mind, and sometimes I get convinced by other people that I was wrong, and like a very humble approach, and that's really classic Benjamin Franklin. But then he said, in these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. What does that mean? He's saying it doesn't matter what, well, it does. Of course it matters what form of government. You want to, especially on paper, make sure that they're as limited as possible in their power. But he's making an important point, something that I've talked about in a number of other episodes, like when I covered James Madison's view in Federalist 48, referring to the Constitution as a mere demarcation on parchment, a parchment barrier, and it's not a sufficient guard to prevent all the powers being consolidated into one. That's what James Madison said. And that's basically what Benjamin Franklin is getting at here as well. It doesn't matter how good or bad a constitution is. If you have good people in office that want to actually advance liberty, you're going to get good results. Now, it makes it a lot easier when the Constitution or the document is bad, but he's saying we are going to have a blessing to the people if this is well administered. And then he says, I believe further that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years. Could that be a few? Could it be 20? Could it be 100? I don't know. He says, and it can only end in despotism. He predicted, as he's saying, let's sign off on this. We've got the best that we can do, and we have to leave it to the people of the future to figure out what to do later on, how to keep things in check, how to advance their own liberty. We can't do this for all time. He says this will end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. So he recognized a flaw in human nature that sooner or later people would demand to be cared for, cradle to grave, protected, cradle to grave by government, some far off government, some close government, it doesn't matter. He knew that all people would become corrupt and demand government control and power. So next up, I want to go to John Dickinson, who I've cited many times, and this is one that I think is just so timeless. His ninth of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, the most read documents on American liberty. He wrote these in 1767 against the hated Townshend Acts, the most read documents on American liberty till the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. And he summed up this ninth paper talking about, he was actually responding to, in this ninth letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania, that some people are saying, well, the tax that you're talking about here, it's not that big. So why are we making a huge deal out of it? And the word precedent, if you Command F or Control F, whatever system you're using, go through this document. Of course, I link to it in the show notes today, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. If you look up the word precedent, it comes up over and over in Dickinson's writing in these letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. And he's pointing out that it doesn't matter if it's just a small usurpation of power, if it's a small tax, this is a precedent for them to expand more. Because, as he advised against the Stamp Act a few years earlier, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains around your miserable country. That's a paraphrase. It's pretty close. But soon as you actually let them get away with one thing, you've set the foundation for them to do much more. And he gave this great example. Spain was once free. Their Cortes, their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. So the people of Spain could not have any money raised on them without the consent of their parliament. This was a pretty fascinating idea at the time. One of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only. And I think this is so timeless, talking about an emergency. We had a tweet yesterday from our 10th Amendment Center account talking about emergencies. And it was just very straight, short, and sweet. Emergencies are temporary, but precedent is forever. We've always heard that government needs more power to do something, even if it violates your rights, whether it was Lincoln taking on habeas corpus or the income tax under Wilson being a temporary wartime measure, or confiscating gold. Maybe that was supposed to be temporary. I haven't looked at that part either. I'm sure FDR stuff was not temporary in their goals either. But we're always told that things are an emergency and we have to give them power to do stuff right now. And that's what he said. He's like, look, the king was not allowed to raise money on the subjects without approval from the parliament. But then they're in the middle of a war. And of course, wartime, that's an emergency. So he thought, well, if I don't have enough money, can I just this one time raise more money without assembling the Cortes? Dickinson goes on. He says, the request was violently opposed. That's how not necessarily, they weren't at war, but violently opposed in that context means it was no holds barred. It was opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession was a precedent. I love how he puts it in all caps, a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So instead of just, it was an emergency against this one war to do one time only, it became a general power for whatever they deemed necessary, I guess, and proper, if we want to do somewhat of a pun. And that's how we can actually approach things like the income tax, for example. This was a temporary wartime measure. Now they have the power forever. What type of emergency powers are they using right now that some people are okay with saying, well, it's temporary, this is a crazy situation, and it doesn't take too much of an imagination to think how someone might use that same type of power and expand on it in the future. That's how we have to look at every single exercise of government power. And he says at that moment, soon as they gave him the precedent, from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful and the people ceased to be free. John Dickinson, penman of the American Revolution, tells us that the moment that they gave the government the power to do things for emergency reasons, even if they approved of it at that time, was the moment that the people of Spain lost their freedom. And next up, the third one I want to cover before telling you my drum roll call on when things went off the rails for the Constitution, comes from President George Washington in his famous 1796 farewell address. And he's talking about how, you can create a real despotism through factions and through exercising power not delegated to the government and the like. And he says, if you've got a problem with how the Constitution is, change it by amendment. It's very straightforward. There is a process built in there. If you don't like it, change it. He says, but let there be no change by usurpation. Usurpation is the term we understand from the founding generation as meaning an exercise of power not delegated to government. It is actually usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people. St. George Tucker in 1803 called it treason against the sovereignty of the people. So Washington says, let there be no change in the Constitution by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent, again, same term, 1767, 1796. We're talking about precedent. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. So George Washington as well, same precedent. So with that, drum roll. Under which president, in my view, did things go completely off the rails for the Constitution and set the foundation for what we live under today? And that is the largest government, the largest military empire in the history of the world. And this is why I think it's going to be surprising for you guys, because I just quoted him, and it's this guy, George Washington. So literally right out of the gates, he took office in April of 1789. I think it was April 30th was his inauguration day. And based on this understanding that precedent is the problem, that we expected things to go off the rails eventually, that the people would demand or be okay with power, and that precedent is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed, there are a number of things that happened in Washington's presidency, specifically around 1791, a little bit earlier. In fact, I'm going to say 1791 was a really bad year. But you can actually go back to that. Dave Benner, Brian McClanahan, and others literally point to the Judiciary Act of 1789, something that Washington signed into law as being a usurpation, debt assumption. I think it was in 1790. So right off the bat, they started exercising powers not delegated to them in the Constitution. And three of them that I want to point to, three policies, three exercises of power that I think are very important for this discussion. First, there was the Northwest Indian War. And this is something that most people don't even know about. And I should actually do a full episode or a couple of episodes on this. They range from well before the Constitution went into effect till about 1794, 1795. But Washington, when he started as president, he said he wanted peace and that violence, war against... There was already war and conflict happening, but he came in looking for peace. And he wanted additional war, expanding the war only as a very last resort. But last resort came incredibly fast. Incredibly fast. And due to a combination, I think, of President Washington being concerned about the country's global image. He was concerned about how it would be viewed to the British. You just went through this whole thing. Of course, there are probably concerns about other people wanting to invade. The British were in the Northwest, things like that. And they wanted to show that they were strong. They were concerned that they would look weak. So they did resort to that last resort pretty quickly. And of course, Americans on the frontier were basically asking for the federal government to come in and save them. And here from an interesting article by, this is a law review paper by Melanie Fernandez. I think it was in 2016 for Gettysburg College. And she put it this way: 2 failed military expeditions against the Indians resulted in a federal reform of the army and militia system, significantly strengthening the power of the federal government. Without the violence of the Northwest Indian War, the demands for protection from U.S. citizens would not have driven Congress to make such federal reforms. American citizens on the frontier inadvertently conceded to a more centralized, more powerful government. Much to the chagrin of these citizens, the desire for a government that had the strength to protect them also created a government with a capable force to use against them. So whatever power you give government to do something today to people you don't like, you're also giving government the power to use against you. And that's what she was getting to. That's what Melanie was really getting to at the end of this really good paper on the Northwest Indian War. I think it's called, I don't remember what the title is, but it's a good long paper. And I encourage you to read it. Of course, it will be linked to in the show notes. She's saying this led to, well, you shouldn't be surprised at what happened in the Whiskey Rebellion. And that is 1791. Another issue, we had the whiskey tax. It was the first tax imposed on domestic product by the newly formed federal government. It was actually on all spirits, not just whiskey, but whiskey, it just became known as that. Of course, we know, and I've done an episode on that. For those of you watching, I've got it pulled up here on the screen. I think how George Washington actually responded to the so-called Whiskey Rebellion is far different than how most people understand it, or how it's actually explained as a precedent for more executive power. And I covered that in some detail. But certainly the excise tax in its first place is also something that was a real problem for people at the time. If you just think about it, of course, Washington sent Hamilton out there pushing this. And of course, Hamilton, the nasty, lying flip-flopper that he was, would present a different case and a different reason as to why the whiskey tax was good, depending on the nature of the audience he was in. That was really his style. He was really just a true politician of our times. But this is an excise tax. And if you remember, or if you paid attention, or if you checked out my episode on Monday, I shared a little history of what happened in 1791. The Continental Congress asked the states for an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. Now, one state could veto it, and asked them for the ability to do just a mere 5% excise tax at the height of the war with Great Britain. And it was first vetoed by Rhode Island, and then Virginia. Well, Virginia withdrew their authorization or the ratification and then vetoed. But they basically were saying an excise tax of any kind intrudes on the sovereignty of the state of Rhode Island, on the state of Virginia. They tried again in 1783, and then New York did it. Can you imagine New York today rejecting a federal power as being an exercise of something that infringes on the sovereignty of New York? That's not something you'd hear, but so things are much different. So we had the whiskey tax, a new tax, and this is part of the power of a centralized government that they fought a long bloody revolution to get away from. They didn't want this type of thing. And even if you could make the case that, okay, they were authorized to do it, you shouldn't be surprised that it set the stage for conflict and more centralization of power. And the real big one that I want to get to is the central bank. In February of 1791, there was a fierce debate. Of course, it's connected to the whiskey tax, the report on manufacturers. Alexander Hamilton, the report on public credit. Alexander Hamilton was creating kind of a mercantilist economic national system. And he really wanted to transition things to a more centralized power. Part of it was to put in the excise tax. Part of it was also to implement a central bank and a bunch of other stuff that they just slammed through. The central bank, the first national bank of the Constitution, had fierce opposition from people like James Madison. Madison himself specifically cited an example of how the ability for the federal government to charter corporations was proposed at the Philadelphia Convention, and they rejected it. So the idea that they could charter a bank was considered, and they didn't even include it. So his point was, someone did this. It was actually him. Someone did this. We said no in Philadelphia, so the people of the several states, those are the people who give the Constitution its legal force, they never even considered that the federal government would have such a power because it wasn't included in the document. And we made a case that the government would be one of expressly delegated powers. Everything else would be reserved to the states or the people. So he vehemently opposed this first national bank of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, but under Hamilton's guidance. And I'm a fan of George Washington too, but maybe I shouldn't be, because he ended up signing it into law anyway. And when he asked James Madison to write the veto message, he asked James Madison to write two potential veto messages in case he decided to do that. One was based on, we don't think this is good policy. And the other one was based on, this is unconstitutional. So he clearly was not certain about the constitutionality and went with it anyways. Maybe because it had an expiration, maybe because he thought it was so important. But really, if you look at his argument in his farewell address, which was originally written by Madison, then written by Madison in 1792, modified by Hamilton in 1796, the message was far different. Don't do it just because you think it's a good idea. Madison, some years later, for example, vetoed an infrastructure spending bill on his last day in office, even though he supported the intent of it because he saw it as a violation of the Constitution. Now, you might be thinking, Bolden, you're splitting hairs there. This is absurd. A lot worse things happened in 1865, agreed, and in 1913, agreed, and in 1933 and 71 and today and the Patriot, all these things are much worse. But you don't go from zero to largest government in the history of the world without first building the foundation for it. And that's what John Dickinson was having to say. That's what even Washington was having to say. That's what, in a way, Benjamin Franklin was having to say. Soon as you give them the power, soon as the people are okay with the power to do this, you've created the despotism, even if the government isn't currently crushing people's lives, liberty, and property. So you might be thinking, okay, well, the war ended in 1795 in the Northwest. The whiskey tax was repealed by Jefferson. They got rid of it in, I think, 1802. The National Bank had its expiration, so did the second one. So they didn't really fall off the rails until Lincoln or Wilson or FDR. But I agree with John Dickinson. I also agree with Thomas Jefferson. And this is how he put it in his February 15th, 1791 argument against the National Bank bill that George Washington signed. He said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. And here's John Adams writing as Novanglis in 1774. And he was also talking about a tax on tea here. He was responding to an argument from someone named Massachusetts who said, let me see if I can pull this. He was responding to Massachusetts who was saying, don't go so crazy about this tax on tea. It's a 3-pence tax. It's not a big deal. And John Adams was saying, no. This is a real problem because as soon as you give them any type of power, you're going to give them a boundless field of power, just like Jefferson said some years later. And he said, obsta principiis, and my Latin is terrible. I know John Adams's Latin wasn't good either, but it's basically nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. And I want to see if I can pull up this full phrase here. Obsta, nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud, he said, is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. So soon as you let them establish the precedent, the liberty is done because sooner or later, someone is going to expand on it, expand on it, expand on it. And those who warned us about that, you may be saying, Bolden, this is just scare taxes. This is just nonsense. They aren't always going to expand on precedent. Well, I think I'm going to side with Dickinson, with Adams, with Jefferson, who say soon as you do one thing, you've given them limitless power. He says, when the people give way, their deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers press upon them so fast that there is no resisting afterwards. The nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. And so really at the end of the day, like Dickinson, like Jefferson, like Adams, and others warned, it's precedent that's the problem. The moment the precedent is established for war, for taxes, for central banking, for whatever, is the moment that people lose their freedom. And with that in mind, I'd say 1791 was a really, really bad year for the Constitution and liberty. You can even go a little further back. And I think it's 1791 or so when things actually went off the rails and we were no longer under constitutional government, literally within months to 2 years of them taking office in 1789. Well, I'm curious what you think about this. If you still want to stick with another year, or you think this is just nonsense. But I'm really going to go with this precedent as the problem. And I think if we take that approach today, we don't look at something as being okay because we like the person in office, or it's too difficult to oppose, or because it's an emergency, or because we're scared. As John Adams, this is also when he was good too. He said, fear is the foundation of most governments. Give them an inch and they'll take 1,000 miles. Cop block hawk string says Latin for GTFO of here. Taking a look at a few other things in the live chat. Richard Banks, we are Liberty Alliance and glad of it. Matt Lally must have been the guy who said 1971. This is awesome. 1791 is an anagram of 1971. I'm going to go with that too. So 1791, 1971, both very bad years. Of course, every single day is a bad day for the Constitution and liberty because now they exercise so much power over our day-to-day lives. They tell us what kind of light bulbs we can have, how big our toilets can be, seriously, what kind of plants we can grow in our own home. Can you think of the people of the several states saying, well, the federal government might decide that a plant you grow is dangerous. Will you guys ratify this? I mean, it was so much opposition to it that it took a deal with John Hancock and Samuel Adams with the Federalists, people like Theophilus Parsons and others in Massachusetts to say, no, 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 we don't trust that you're going to follow these limits on the Constitution. You're going to see these as expressly delegated. We need what eventually became the 10th Amendment to make it very clear that they're only authorized to exercise those powers delegated to them. Now, relying on government to limit its own power has been a serious problem. Or, as Washington warned and as Washington did, being okay with doing something for an emergency or because you like the policy or you think it's temporary also establishes the precedent that destroys the Constitution and liberty. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I'm curious what you think about my view on this. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I will look through the chat a little bit later today. Please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. If you're on the video platform, smashing likes, leaving comments, subscribing, getting notifications, all that stuff will trigger the algorithm of the mainstream platform and tell them to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It starts out as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, I really appreciate you being here today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.